Hello, good afternoon and welcome to the OMQ Zoom room. OMQ stands for Office Managers Quarterly, which is ISE's quarterly network, the best network in London for business linchpins to come together, share their experiences and get to know each other's businesses and help each other out. We'd normally meet in our Regent Street offices, but for obvious reasons, we are doing this. So thank you so much for being a part of it. We want to still be able to support you and consult with you through this difficult time. In a moment, our founders, Susanna and Ava, will share a little bit on the rationale for this call and kick off discussion. Today's meeting will be super practical, tips around sanitation, office setup and staffing scheduling. Many of you have already submitted topics and questions, so thank you so much. We'll be getting to lots of those today and hopefully quite a few more. As mentioned, this is going to be a super practical session, so some of the questions submitted will have to be dealt with on another call. For example, the psychological effects of staff returning to offices. As mentioned, we're going to keep it super practical today, but hopefully that just means more opportunity for us to get together and follow up. We've planned for this session to be an hour. We are delighted to be joined by Matthew Blossom from Peninsula Business Services. Peninsula are an award-winning HR, health and safety and employee wellbeing specialist. Matthew himself is a legal consultant, an expert in the field and able to advise on up to the moment COVID-related changes. So he's going to be talking through changes as they've happened and how they're going to be affecting your business. The core things which you need to focus on in order to prepare yourself for the next 12 weeks and the things that those 12 weeks are expected to bring. He's armed with your questions ahead of time, so he'll be talking around those and also delving into other things which come up today. He will also be available after this Zoom room for a one-to-one bespoke call with you about your business, which is a complimentary thing that he's offering. So we'll circulate his details and you can arrange that, which is an absolutely fantastic resource. So thank you, Matthew, so much for that. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm now going to introduce Susanna Lawson, one of our founders.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming onto our call today and a warm welcome from all of us at ISE. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces here and also some new people as well. Welcome. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we're doing this, and after first adjusting to working from home and of course being on lockdown for the last 6 weeks, at ISE we started to look at our business, and which is of course recruitment, and how we could actually help our candidates and clients during this time. So we started a number of calls and just communicating really with everyone, and initially we were talking more about adjusting to working from home and how people's roles might have changed. That led to a document being produced on that, and some of you may have seen the work from home document. So we realised that actually our offering is our network. And so as now we're entering this different phase of lockdown and of course the upcoming government announcements, we're all looking to the future and how we might re-enter our places of work. So we therefore felt it would be useful to have a forum to share what's been learned so far and of course give any pointers that your firm may not have considered yet. So we do hope that you find this very useful. And I'd now like to pass you over to Ava, who will take us through the first steps.
So thanks, Susanna. So hopefully the content of this call is going to be useful for everyone, whichever level of planning you're at. So as Jen has mentioned, we're going to cover those three core topics: the sanitation, the physical spacing, but also the support to staff. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matthew.
I would first and foremost, thank you very much, Ava. The way, I'm trying to think where to start with so many people on the Zoom. I've got a series of questions that people have asked, and there's no question on the list that I've been given for everybody today that I haven't been asked already. So I'm going to cover quite a lot of these questions, and some of you watching are going to know that's your question. Some of you are going to think, oh, actually, yeah, that's a question I'd like to know the answer to anyway. And some of them I'm going to be able to answer quite directly. I'm going to be able to say, this is what the government states, or this is what you need to do. For other people and for other businesses, it is going to be a case of what your business does and how it does it. Because certain companies, whichever way you look at this and how COVID is now developing, it's going to be essential, I would say, from Monday, that you have a COVID-19 risk assessment and policy set up within your business. And some of the questions we're going to go through now will dictate what you do need to have or don't need to have. But as it's been explained already, anybody who is concerned by what I say today, anybody who feels like they're a little bit exposed, I am going to offer free one-to-one consultations for anybody, because you may not necessarily want to answer sensitive information anyway about your business in such a large forum. But also it gives us the chance to speak properly about what you do and don't have in place, and I can put together recommendations and guidelines so you can at least go away so that your business is protected as possible. But it really is a tricky one, because no one expected COVID-19 to hit whatsoever. And what it's done is, for many businesses, it has highlighted some of the flaws that they had in their already existing sort of health and safety. So if I have a look at this, it's quite interesting actually, because I think the top question I get asked all the time is, well, it's great you know about this stuff, Matthew, but when is the government going to tell me? When am I going to get an email or a letter or a communication from the health and safety executive to say, these are the things you now have to do in order to run a compliant business? And I think sadly, the answer is never. I don't think the government are going to make official statements on this other than what they are already putting on the health and safety executive website. And the core reason for this is, once a business has got 5 employees or more, they have to appoint what's called a competent person. And I'm guessing for most of the people watching this, if you are sort of as an office manager, operations manager, you may have been given the title of competent person, and you may have been told this is your job now within health and safety, which is absolutely fine. But what the law has now sort of changed to do is say, if you've got that title, it's actually your company directors who are responsible to ensure you are qualified and trained to basically do that duty. So if you don't know where to start with Corona, or if you don't know where to start with your basic health and safety tasks, the first port of call is to explore that, obviously in a sensitive way, with the directors of your company, to see what support additionally they can offer you, because it is a legal requirement. This is something that they should be doing anyway if you've got 5 employees. So if you've got a competent person with access to competent advice, you'll never ever need to wait for the government to make an announcement, because you're going to be given that information as and when it comes through. And there's lots of different companies who offer this. You know, Peninsula do. We offer, you know, this live service, but there's many, many other companies who do this. So being a competent person is going to be the key to this. And I suspect most of you are, or most of you have been given that hat. So what elements of existing health and safety and occupational health advice need to be updated? Predominantly, it's going to be around infectious disease and dangerous occurrences. So having risk assessments in place to see which of your employees are going to be exposed to Corona and which aren't. Are people working together within 2 meters? Are people sharing vehicles and equipment? You know, so in an office environment, is it possible they'll share the same stapler? All of these things will have to go into that risk assessment so you can work out what to do next. And then really strong, solid training for those employees. And again, that training will be heavily based on what their daily duties are anyway, but training is going to be the key, because if any claims are made in the future, perhaps from someone who gets Corona and it changes their life, or perhaps affects a loved one, in the midst of grief, what you don't want is for someone to make a claim against your company to say that because the Corona outbreak hadn't been taken as seriously, or perhaps not all legislation was being followed, they somehow now deem you liable for this happening. So being able to prove that you really push this message to your staff about the safety, about the distancing, about the cleanliness, that's going to be critical. And for most businesses, the average business, you're not going to have very strong infectious disease controls in place, because infectious disease wasn't a problem up until 6 weeks ago. And now all of a sudden we're having to deal with a pandemic. The closest we ever got to this before was the SARS outbreak, which didn't really reach British shores. And although some companies got prepared for it, you know, it was insignificant compared to what we're experiencing now. So your infectious disease policies will absolutely have to be updated. But then there's other policies as well to consider outside of health and safety. At the moment, we are very fortunate where employees are being furloughed and the employers are being paid to do so. When we get another outbreak, and this is going to come round in another wave, in fact, it's quite fascinating. The studies have now shown from most scientists, from most experts, that this wave now, this is actually our second wave. And the first wave did in fact appear somewhere between September and September and December this year. I personally, just before Christmas, came down with the most horrific illness I've had of my life. There's probably a few people nodding, watching this, going, yeah, I came down with something just before Christmas. GP surgeries, and it's taken them a long time to get this data together, but GP surgeries were inundated between September and December of this mystery illness that carries all of the symptoms of COVID. I had it, and I carried all the symptoms, but of course I didn't even hear about Corona or COVID until late January, so I didn't even associate it with that illness. So what's quite important to remember is that when this does come back again, and people are unable to be furloughed, that you have got a policy in place in your business that will allow you to shorten your employees' working hours. Because if you furlough them again without paying them, and you're not going to get the money back from the government, technically that will be classed as a breach of contract. If you have a policy in place now, a shortage of work policy, for example, that states in extreme circumstances, if we have to close, we will reduce your hours, that is going to save you so much time moving forward, and a lot of money financially. And there is going to be, like I say, at least another 2 waves of this coming around. So as well as your health and safety policies, it's well worth looking at some of your employment law policies in regards to shortage of work or laying staff off. Some of you will already have that in place, some of you won't. So that's an important one. First aid training, dealing with COVID, what's required? Yes, we all now need to have more of an awareness of COVID. I would suggest cautiously the only additional first aid training people will need is perhaps taking temperatures of employees when they come, when they go. This could be something that the government's going to recommend. In many countries now, they've got automatic sensors set up outside of offices and factories and manufacturing. So when people walk in, a camera automatically takes their temperature. McDonald's are going to be introducing this when they reopen shortly. I think it's the 13th of May. But don't quote me on that, but they are going to reopen, and that's going to be one of their prerequisites, that all staff get their temperature taken before and at the end of a shift. What reporting requirements will there be if an office manager suspects an outbreak? So this is a very good question. It's not so much suspecting an outbreak that is the issue here. The law changed, or I should say was amended 2 weeks ago under something called RIDDOR. And I don't know if RIDDOR is a phrase that many of you are familiar with. It's the reporting of injuries, disease, and dangerous occurrence regulations. And in plain English, if somebody from your business contracts corona, you have to be able to prove that it didn't happen in the workplace. And if you are unable to prove that it didn't happen in the workplace, so there's a possibility that it did, you have to report the company and that incident to the health and safety executive. It's going to be classed as a criminal offence if you don't, so it has to be done. The fine, the starting point, is £20,000 if that is not reported to RIDDOR. So it's very, very important that you do that, and that your accident reporting procedures reflect this. And again, I'm going to say this a few times throughout the session. If any of this is sort of setting off alarm bells, you're not sure what some of these things are I'm talking about, it's absolutely fine. I'll be able to talk to you about this and give you information, perhaps to take to your directors, you know, to educate them a little bit on some of these new responsibilities, because a lot of this only came into effect in October 2016. The amendments to Riddle, which are normally when somebody has an accident in work and has to go to hospital, so you have to report that, they were amended to also include corona roughly 2 weeks ago. So it's not so much an outbreak, as I say, it's if anybody has suspected corona, that will need to be reported. Some of the more practical things, you know, should firms adopt an approach for testing if large-scale testing becomes available? I think the testing is going to be a tricky one purely because of the expense. I think a more practical solution, as it stands right now, is temperature testing. That seems to really be hitting the nail on the head, because although people can be contagious for up to 2 to 3 weeks, it's only when they're really in the throes of it that it is at its most contagious. It's no surprise that Germany has had the lowest in Europe, or some of the lowest cases in Europe, and they were testing from the beginning. That's all they've done. There's now news today, actually, that Germany are really going to loosen their restrictions. I believe 2 people from more than one household will be allowed to meet. Offices and things like that are going to be allowed to open again. So they're really starting to restrict, to open up those restrictions now. And the bulk of that has been put down to testing. Now, alongside that, and funnily enough, it's the next question, implementing protection and hygiene measures, you know, distributing hand wash, reviewing cleaning arrangements. Who's responsible for this? In a nutshell, the director of a company is responsible for the health and safety in their business. Under the Health and Safety Act 1974, the buck starts and stops with the director, and it's only by putting in the relevant training and support to whoever their competent person is that then takes some of that blame and shift away from them. So if there isn't a health and safety policy that's been signed off in the last 12 months, if staff aren't receiving health and safety training, and if risk assessments aren't being regularly completed, then chances are currently that sadly the director of that firm is going to be behind legislation and is at risk of prosecution, not just from someone having an accident, but from the health and safety executive just doing a spot check. And there will be spot checks done once people go back to work for corona. There is going to be, they've said this already, there's going to be an entire task force dedicated to making sure business is honouring the things that it needs to be honoured. What else have we got here? What responsibilities do landlords have to ensure that communal areas are cleaned? Will it be legally enforceable? So again, because this comes under health and safety law, it's absolutely legally enforceable, and it comes under criminal law. So with landlords particularly, it's going to be based around the cleanliness. They're going to have to demonstrate that they've done a risk assessment to see what the footfall is going to be like realistically in those communal areas. And based on that, and the times of that footfall, when the best times to be are going to be to clean it, because ultimately you are going to have cleaners in fairly regularly using all sorts of different chemicals and procedures. Because if someone does contract an illness and they say it's because that communal area was dirty, you're going to be asked for that information. You're going to be asked for the risk assessment. You're going to be asked for what you had put in place for that. So yeah, for landlords in general, that's quite a large one. But just for anyone who has a company, even the communal areas of maybe a managed office, and you're not in that communal area, you still have a responsibility to your staff if you know they're going to go through a communal area to get to your business. So they still have to have training about washing their hands before a shift, after a shift, using the antibacterial wipes. If you've got people using vehicles, having a thorough, deep clean in between people using different vehicles and different equipment. I think it's fair to say whatever happens next, for the next 12 to 18 months until we get a vaccine, and it's going to be a minimum of 12 months before a vaccine is developed because of the testing involved. Life is going to be very different, and we are going to be living in a world where more of us, many of us, are wearing masks, wearing gloves, and having to have lots of sort of weird and wonderful procedures put into place. How often do touch points need to be cleaned? As often as they're touched is the answer to that. So as soon as a different person is going to use something, you have to be able to prove there is a system in place to clean it and to monitor that has happened. And that is going to be the case with any touch points. It's going to be easier, dependent on what your business does, to set up individual equipment for individual people with individual partitions. because that way it's just going to need a clean at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, as opposed to every time somebody goes into a new one. Hot desking is not going to be practical. You'd spend more time cleaning the desk before someone is sitting at it. So for any businesses out there that do hot desking, talk to me, because I'll be able to give you some more practical solutions around that. How to find and select suppliers, ensuring sanitizer is constantly available. That's going to be very difficult. And my advice, and this is something I was speaking to Jen about earlier today, actually, you saw how hard it was for the government to get PPE. And part of that was because we are no longer members of the EU. So the whole of Europe did a collective PPE buy, and someone forgot to tap us on the shoulder to ask if we would like to be a part of that. So this is why we are playing catch up now. Like the rest of the world, just like India is, and China and America, we're all trying to play catch up to get PPE. We've got it, but it took the UK government an incredibly long time. So if you can imagine sort of sat in your office trying to ring up for some gloves and some masks, you may be ordering 100 or 200 at a time. You know, the government were ordering millions and they struggled. So when you know what PPE you need, and it's likely you'll need gloves, you'll need masks, and you'll need sanitizers, order now. Order now with the intention of being able to open your business again in the summer. If you order in the summer, when everyone gets the green light, they're going to be back orders going through to Christmas. I can categorically guarantee it. And you simply won't be allowed to operate without some of those things in place. So the core message for today, and I will repeat this again at the end, is to identify now the risks you're going to need to put them into place and order that PPE now. My company does not sell PPE. We have nothing to do with it. So this isn't sort of me saying, by the way, I've got loads of masks, come and see me. I can't help in that respect, but the strong advice I can give you based on the problems that my clients have is order that now. It's the best advice I can give anybody, I think, because without it, you're not going to be able to operate. Do companies advise staff to wear PPE in office? If so, what, and does the company provide it? If it's identified you have to wear PPE in the office, then absolutely the company needs to provide that. But what's going to be probably more practical is by having 2 meters apart with desks, ensuring people are cleaning before and after, using the hand wash and scrubs. Those are the things that are going to help you more. Having a mask when you're on the phone isn't going to help very much within your job. And it's going to be unnecessary if you're honouring the 2 meters. The 2 meters is there to stop the spread. That's also why the mask is there. The mask doesn't do a lot to stop you catching corona. It simply helps stop the spread of it. If you're in a situation, however, where perhaps you aren't 2 meters apart and it is less than that, then yeah, other options will need to be explored. And it could be gloves and PPE. You know, the thing that has to be remembered with gloves is you can't wear them all day. They're for very short periods of time because they too carry they carry the virus. So if people are wearing gloves, it's more for when they are completing certain tasks. They remove the gloves, and when they have to complete a similar task, they put them back on. So this could be delivery drivers, for example. You deliver a package, you take off your gloves, off you go. Then when you do the next package and you're using gloves, you're not spreading any contagion that you may have got from that previous visit. So that's going to be quite important for you as well. But again, it depends on your office layout, how much space there is within the office, things like your ventilation system. So how can staff maintain a 2 meter physical distance between each other? It's a good point, and doing what the supermarkets have been doing is probably the strongest. Really clear markings. It's not reasonable to expect the average human being to know exactly what 2 meters is or isn't. So having those lines clearly defined at crucial points, toilets, perhaps water cooler, the kitchenette, if the risk assessment allows those to be open and accessed, that's going to be really the only practical way you've got of doing so. And again, it's that education piece, just making sure everybody knows what is expected of them and what will happen if they don't follow it. Because if someone isn't following the regulations, or they're messing around a little bit and perhaps not taking it as seriously, although it may be sort of a little bit jovial in the office, that can carry very serious criminal repercussions for the company director. So anything like that has to be treated in the same way. Best advice is to have a quiet word in that person's ear and just remind them of the severity of it. If anything continues after that, really and truly, you would need to go down some sort of disciplinary action, because it's not just their own life they're putting in danger, it's potentially those other employees and work colleagues that they live with. And although they could all be in very low risk categories, you don't know who people live with or who people associate with. And technically, and this is quite, it is a little bit scary, if one of your employees does have corona, they do catch it, and then a loved one does die, if they decide that it's because of the poor sanitation or because they weren't being treated as strongly as they could have been, they're going to absolutely have a case and a claim, and it is highly likely that you'll get a visit from the health and safety executive asking to see what you have in place. And again, it's just not a position you want to be in, especially in this kind of climate. How do you socially distance desks when floor boxes are already in place? It's going to be very tricky. Extension leads, temporary tabling and desks is really the only answer to that. Although, and this, I'm just having a look at some of the other questions. Yeah, this will relate to most of them. The government are only going to let you go back to an office if you cannot work from home. So if you have an internet connection and that's working, they are going to insist for the foreseeable future that those people remain at home. You're not going to have that social office feeling for quite a long time. Probably past Christmas, I'm going to suspect, before they allow that. That doesn't mean people won't be able to go out anymore, but it does mean that, yeah, officers and people sitting together, that's not going to come back anytime soon. So actually, I think that the questions here for guidance on meeting rooms, should certain areas of the office be off limits? If the kitchen is closed, what do you do about drinking water? These are really critical, because an employer has a responsibility legally to make sure that staff have access to hot running water, to be able to access drinking water. And it might not be practical in the office once you've done a COVID risk assessment to have people in there, because you can't contain an outbreak of that many people in such close quarters. So I would suggest that the real risk assessments are going to be, can this person work from home? If they can, what do we have to put in place to make sure that those people, their legal responsibilities are being met? It's quite a funny one, really, because most people aren't aware of this, but even if you have employees working from home, how do I put this? If you have employees working from home, you've got the same exact legal responsibility as if they're working in your office. So if you've got people at home still working and they've not been given training on how to sit in a chair correctly, if you've not given them training on how to reach to get things from shelves, if you've not given them training, believe it or not, and slips and trips in their own household, if someone were to have an accident whilst working at home for you, and you've not done a risk assessment on their home and on their area that you've asked them to work in, they are again going to have a completely viable claim against your company directors. So it is important that if you're asking people to work from home, that you are doing those risk assessments. And all these questions about desks and sort of where people should and shouldn't be sitting, still doing that, but actually asking people about their home and the setup. Some people will simply be sat on their sofa, hunched over with a laptop, working away on a coffee table. Those people will be able to make claims for injury, personal injury at work in the future, if you can't prove that you told them not to do that, and you've demonstrated that they should be sat on a big chair, perhaps in their kitchen, at the kitchen table. All of these things carry fines of thousands and thousands of pounds. And it's predominantly paid out by your insurance, your liability insurers. But once that claim's made against you, it's highly likely your premiums are going to go up next year. So protecting yourself from a personal injury claim at home whilst working for you, I would suggest is the bigger priority when it comes to risk assessments. In an office, it's unlikely people will be going back anytime soon. And it leads on to quite a natural question about people returning to work, worried about using public transport. And I'm dealing with cases like this myself at the moment, where staff are just point blank refusing to go in. As it stands right now under current employment law, it's deemed as unreasonable for an employee to not go into work, citing using public transport as the reason. It may morally, may not be the most popular thing, but there's no legal reason that an employee can refuse to come into work unless they believe the workplace itself is going to be unsafe. They can't cite the way they get into work as being the problem. So public transport isn't an issue, but if you do get that, come to me, because there's a certain way that you need to deal with that. You can't just sort of tell the person, tough, you're coming in. Is there any action taken to companies, is there any action companies can take to support in this area? What's a company's duty of care? Should companies insist PPE is worn on journeys as well? Okay, so a duty of care for the company, it's basically, it boils down to when that person gets to your office, is in your site. So whether it be a managed office and they step foot on the car park, or if you've got different sites all around the country and they get to it, your duty of care starts at that point. It also starts whilst they're doing anything you have asked them to do. So this could be a meeting they've had to go to out of town. This could be something as simple as working from home. But essentially, while somebody is on the clock, wherever it is they are, the company, or more importantly, the company directors, are 100% responsible for that person's safety. PPE, it's probably a good idea to recommend to your staff that if they are coming in, to use PPE, but this is going to be more mask based. It's not going to do a lot by wearing gloves. You can ask them to use hand sanitizers. But yeah, you could ask them to wear PPE on the way in for extra protection. But again, all that's going to do is stop them passing it on to other people. It has very, very mild effects when it actually comes to catching the illness itself. So you can't be held responsible if someone caught it on the bus, for example. That would be a little bit unreasonable, it would be considered. How will visitors to the office be dealt with? Strict quarantine in place for many countries, even after restrictions have been lifted. What will the new criteria for allowing staff members to travel be? I think that is a really good question, and nobody knows the answer to this yet. Face-to-face meetings are going to be outlawed under the new rules until we've got a vaccine, that's for sure. So I think face-to-face meetings and travel for business is going to be the same. We are all learning and adapting to this kind of technology. If you'd have said to me 3 months ago, every meeting you have is going to be through a screen, you know, I'd have completely laughed. It's not something that a lot of businesses do, and it certainly isn't the way they deal with business every day. But the world's changed, and we're all going to have to stick to this now. We're all going to have to dive into it at risk of prosecution. So I think travel to other countries for business is going to be unlawful. I think the only exceptions you're going to have at the moment is for visiting friends and family. I have heard they're lifting some of the restrictions to travel to Tenerife, allegedly for holiday. Watch this space. If that happens, it's going to cause a whole host of problems. So no, sadly as it stands, you're not going to be able to travel away, especially to countries that have got lower ratings of perhaps sanitation or lower human rights issues, or lower health and safety standards, because you're going to put that member of staff of yours at risk. And again, if we tune into the fact that whilst they're on the clock, no matter where they are or what they're doing, they're your responsibility. It wouldn't be deemed as safe to send them to another country in that way. So how will cohorting, keeping teams of people in work together as small as possible, work? The only way it can work is, again, with social distancing. If you can't social distance, if you categorically have to have people working near each other, such as in food preparation, you know, a lot of fast food restaurants, they can't have 2 meters apart. A lot of the takeaway and Indian takeaway shops, in general, I should say, are going to have to take into account that their staff will be very close together. And the easiest way to deal with that is to have people working back to back. So one person's preparing food here, another person's preparing food there. You have a big partition up at the front. That's going to help, you know, massively. It is going to help greatly. But every single restaurant, every single takeaway, every single food shop is going to be very, very different. For some people, it can affect how they pray. It can affect other people in regards to how they communicate with others. And when you're doing your risk assessments, all of this is going to be taken into account, just so you don't do accidental discrimination, where you haven't meant to do it, but sadly, someone's human rights have not been met. So that's quite important when you're actually determining that, but social distancing all the way. How is the best to implement this for investment professionals and support staff? It's going to be the same way for every single person you work with, regardless of their job. Implementing it, it's going to be the same thing. You will do a risk assessment. From that risk assessment, you will create a policy. From that policy, you will give the staff the relevant training. And that's the structure you'll have to follow for any circumstance moving forward. What's the government definition of essential? And who should still work from home? So as it stands right now, the government's essentials are, I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but you've got hardware shops, you've got anything to do with food, you've got pharmacies, you've got bike shops. They're going to be the core ones. That's not really going to lift anytime soon. But once we get to July, and I've seen some government reports, it does look as though they're going to ease that up a little bit. They're talking about cafeterias and restaurants specifically, how they're going to reopen for the summer. So I think that should be quite good. But no, at the moment, essential is based on people who need something in order to live. So the whole argument behind bike shops is it's transport that you can take to keep yourself healthy, so it forms part of exercise. Hardware shops, people are spending more time at home, so it's essential that they're able to make that living environment better. But other than that, it's going to be based around medicine, it's going to be based around care, and it's going to be based around food production of some kind. Phased return versus timetabled groups. So that's something the business is going to have to decide. But when furlough ends, and it does look as though it was going to end on an edge at the end of June, and the Chancellor has now been forced to say, we're not going to do it like that. From July, it's highly likely that the furlough rate is going to drop to 60%. If you remember, they only ever guaranteed it until June. That was the only guarantee. Once we get to the end of June, expect now that furlough is going to go down to 60%. From the end of July, I think you could expect for it to disappear completely, possibly drop down to 40%. So it's important that your documents and policies now let you stagger people back into work. So phased returns and timetables, they're only allowed if you've got the permission of your staff. And if you don't have their permission now, it's critical that that is put in place so that when you are allowed to open in July, August, that if you need to phase your staff back in, you're able to. Otherwise, they will have to be paid full salary or it's classed as a breach of contract. Incidentally, whilst we're talking about this, if you haven't got permission from your staff to furlough them, and if you haven't sent them all a letter explaining that they've been furloughed and the reasons why, that in itself is classed as a breach of contract. I have a standard furlough letter that I'm more than happy to email out to anybody. It's sort of furlough by numbers. You fill in the gaps, you put the person's name in, you take out the bits that aren't relevant, and you've got a solid legal furlough letter. That's really important that all your employees get that letter, because in 6 to 12 months' time, when they start getting the PPI style adverts appear saying, were you ever furloughed? Were you sent a letter? You're entitled to compensation. That is going to impact a lot of companies massively, because regardless of you having that conversation or not, it has to be physically in writing that they have agreed to that. And funnily enough, the only reason they are agreeing to it right now is because you've said we'll still pay you 80% of your salary to stay at home. Imagine having to say to someone in 8 to 12 weeks' time, we might not need you for this week or next week, and we also can't pay you. Do you agree to that? Most are going to say no. No, we don't agree to that. So it's important you introduce a policy now that lets you tell your staff, we're going to have to reduce your hours without there being any legal comeback. And if anyone is sufficiently concerned about that, again, I'm more than happy to cover that in our one-on-one and consultation. Same thing for staggering work hours. How instructional versus collaborative are management intending to be about the team? So it's difficult to get the balance right between people gauging comfort and returning. Yeah, there's going to be there's going to be discomfort, I should say, for a lot of employees. Some people are now going to be used to working at home. And I think that's going to be the biggest struggle. It's not so much getting people back into work, sort of engaging in their work. It's getting people back into work when they've been used to waking up at maybe 7 o'clock to start at 8 o'clock, when traditionally they'd be getting up at 5 a.m. to catch a bus and come in. And I think taking that into account, especially after all of this time, is going to be the bigger issue. Welfare checks of your staff, and I'm not going to, because this is about the practicalities today, but having welfare checks of your staff is going to be the key to that. And there are going to be sessions in the future where we really talk about that emotional aspect and impact of your staff. But ultimately, if that's something that you're not monitoring, it's going to be very, very difficult to even measure what the psychological impact is going to be. I'm very different to a lot of my colleagues. There's not a lot you can ask me to do that I'm not going to do when it comes to working for my company. But there are other people who wouldn't want to go to maybe certain parts of the UK because they're not with their loved ones. They don't want to be on their own. So everyone reacts to different situations. So if you're not measuring the psychological impact of Corona on your staff, it's well worth doing just so you can learn about them for when you do need to make decisions in the future. So what criteria do you use to recall staff? How do you make a clear rationale as to why particular staff or roles need to return physically? Will you consider both business? Not all restrictions can be lifted at the same time. Have you? Yep. So ultimately, when you're deciding who's coming back, why they're coming back, and what they're going to do, that's going to rest on two separate things. The first one, we're going to go back to your risk assessment, your policy, and your training, but then also the business need. And we will help you, or I will help you, I should say, draw up a business plan if you need it, to show that this simply couldn't be done from home. And it can't be a case of it's better when we do it in the office, it's better when we do it, in the factory. If that job can be done from home, at the moment, it must be done from home. There's no leeway whatsoever around this. I'm already dealing with a case at the moment with an art gallery in central London where an employee was working from the gallery of their own request, I might add. They said, I really want to stay going into work, and the owner said, okay, fine. They've now just put in a claim against them for putting them in unnecessary danger, which is quite ludicrous, and we are working hard on it. But the problem we've got in the defence is the fact that the government have said you must work from home, and they're being very strict on this. They're being incredibly strict. So only bring staff back into your workplace if it is physically impossible for them to work from home. That's going to be the core message for a long time now. It's not really going to decrease. If you work in hospitality, I think, yeah, that some of these things are actually going to be relevant. And how you recall staff for that is going to be based on the numbers, how many more customers you expect to receive, how many orders you're expecting to fulfill, that kind of thing. So again, it's really important that when that day comes in July, you've already got a policy in place that states, well, because we're in uncertain times and we've literally just opened the doors this week, we're only going to have one person in this week, or we're only going to have people working half their shift this week until we know what's happening. And you can't do any of that unless you've already got a policy in writing. But what makes that easier is something called the Good Work Plan, which you may or may not have heard of. It came into effect as of the 6th of April 2020, and it's 52 new laws, new pieces of legislation for employment law that came into effect from that date. For the last 3 years, we've had Brexit dominating the headlines. We then had the election with Boris. We then had Corona, the biggest pandemic the world has seen, in recent history for sure, if you're not discounting the Spanish one. So in regards to that, most businesses haven't heard that you now have to give a contract of employment on the first day of employment. Most businesses are not aware that it is a legal requirement to keep a record of all their staff's working hours and breaks. it's not really well known that you have to calculate someone's holiday pay based on every hour they work. So if someone does an hour's overtime, they still have to be given holiday allowance for that hour's overtime. And under the new legislation, your contracts have to spell this out. So if somebody starts at your company after the 6th of April and you haven't updated your contracts for the Good Work Plan, and it's roughly, if you look at an average contract, it's roughly a 50% increase in contract size and policies, you are categorically hiring against legislation, and you are going to be susceptible to a claim at some point. Roughly at the moment, the fines on average are about £1,000, and that's compensation that goes straight to the employee. So the thing to look at here is your employees are good people. They're not looking at ways to make claims against you to gain money, but you have to appreciate that if they see an advert on the internet that says, does your contract have this clause? If not, it's your legal right and you may be entitled to £10,000. You can understand why someone who's on a fixed salary might send off their contract just to see, just to have a look at what they may be entitled to. And because of the Good Work Plan and the way it's come about effectively in the middle of a pandemic, there's going to be a huge no-win, no-fee community out there absolutely taking advantage of the fact that businesses are unaware of this. So again, if anyone has concerns about the Good Work Plan, and if you're unsure of what the Good Work Plan is, I've got some documentation and notes that I'm happy to send to ISE, and they can forward that to yourself. Or if during our one-to-one session, if you want to take me up on that, you want to say, Matt, talk to me about this Good Work Plan and how it affects us, I'm happy to do so. Because there's 52 new laws, there's just so much to go through, but those are the core things that you need to remember. They have to have a contract on day one. It has to include all of their new rights, including that holiday pay will be calculated on every hour they work. But I think the most significant change is for anyone who engages with self-employed people. If you now start somebody from the 6th of April on a self-employed basis, and you don't conduct what is called a worker status test. So essentially, a little test that decides if they're an employee or if they should actually be classed as self-employed. If you don't conduct that, and that person does not pay the correct tax to HMRC, HMRC will categorically be able to come after you and your business for that backdated tax because it's a legal requirement that you take that test. So if you do engage with self-employed people, there's now a certain document that you have to go through, and there's a certain contract, a contract for services that you have to give them. It effectively spells out that they're not an employee, that they are able to substitute their work whenever they like, that they're not entitled to sort of holiday, that they're not entitled to sickness or maternity because they are self-employed. If you don't have all of that in writing, as of the 6th of April, for anyone you engage after that point, so anyone that's in place now, that's fine. But when you hire somebody from now effectively, they need to have that new documentation. So because of this, it wouldn't be unusual for you to say to all of your employees, the Good Work Plan has just landed, you've got all of these new rights, here's your contracts, sign them, make sure you're happy with it. And some of the clauses in those new contracts are also going to be there to help the business. Like I say, a shortage of work policy, a layoff policy, all of those different things will be in the contract as well. And although an employee can object, ultimately, if they don't have a reason, a strong reason, so you can't object to a layoff policy just because you don't like it. You can't do that. You have to have a solid reason. So as long as you consult and give 30 to 60 days before you implement these changes, even if some people say no to it, those changes can still be implemented. And all it means is in 2 months' time, when perhaps you've got to reduce hours, when perhaps you've got to decide who comes in and who doesn't, you're going to legally be allowed to do so. And if someone challenges that in a tribunal, they're not going to be able to make a claim and they're not going to be able to win. So there's a lot more I could say and do, but I'm very aware of time. And what I don't want to do is sort of take over from anybody else's spot or any other messages that were going to be given to you today. But I am doing one-on-ones for absolutely anybody who feels concerned by this, especially if it's been made your responsibility to do all of this, because I can help you talk to your directors, show them that actually legislation has changed now, and that if they don't put something in place to support you, and it doesn't have to be with me, it can be with absolutely anybody, but if you don't have something in place to support you, then technically that is now going against legislation, and it is a criminal prosecution for the directors. You're helping, believe me or not, you're helping them by letting them know this. Some of them may not always want to know immediately, but you're definitely helping them by knowing, because the health and safety executive, because it's criminal law, they've got to be ruthless. If they know an accident may happen, and this is again the other thing, you're not prosecuted on what has happened, you're prosecuted on what could happen. So if you don't have the appropriate health and safety in place, and you're not doing the corona risk assessments, worst case scenario is everyone in your business gets an infectious disease, and the fines and prosecutions for that are very, very, very high. And I'm very aware of, when I talk about this, that, you know, I talk about fines a lot, I talk about prosecutions. I don't want to scare anybody, you know, that's not the intentions of this. And for the bulk of people here today, no one in their office is going to have a dangerous accident. No one's going to die. However, there are going to be people in this room today whose employees will try and make a claim against them at some point in the future, either because they feel that they've not been treated fairly, or because something has happened and they've now had an accident and they want to try and get some money back from that. So it is really important that, although it's not likely there'll be a prosecution or sort of a criminal fine, I can't tell you the repercussions without mentioning those things. So it is to be borne in mind when deciding what to do next. But like I say, I can give you a bespoke one-to-one about your business, what you physically need to put in place in those actions. But most importantly, if anybody wants a toolkit for Corona, so a furlough letter, the basics, just so you know what to do next, I've got those on tap, and I'm happy to send that out to anybody who requests it. So if you just need that basic bit of support rather than in-depth questions, I can offer that to you as well. So I just want to say thank you today for my hosts, you know, Eva, Susanna and Jen. Thank you for bringing me in today. I'd like to think everybody learned at least one thing from today. I hope I've not bored anybody too much. And yeah, any questions you've got, any further follow-up questions, send those to your hosts, who will make sure they get to me, and I will be able to contact you directly. But no, thank you very much. And if anyone does have any questions, I have got some time left over, dependent on how long this lasts for.
Thank you, Matt. I think Jen's been questions coming into the chat box, so I think she's gonna go over those.
Well,
yeah,
I think I think you'll be inundated for requests for the Corona ready to go toolkit. So I won't ask about availability.
It's quite easy for me to give that out.
Good, and that'll be complimentary, will it?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Well, that's probably going to answer all the other questions, but thank you so much for that input. I mean, it was really fantastic, and I'm sure that if this were a real room, it would be filled with applause right now.
Oh, thank you. I put my blush filter on there.
So just one thing that came up, which I thought might make people a bit nervous, which I completely understand. Could you just take a moment, and this could be in your toolkit, so yeah. Sorry if you've answered that, just to talk a little bit more about how we could, or how you could support people with the whole risk assessment for working from home, because obviously it's really nerve-wracking. Like, how do you kind of trust people are filling it out properly? Where can you go to for advice? How do you need to see photographs of the home, like things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. So it's the risk assessment itself is going to be based on what you know about the property. So where is this person working from? Are they working from a kitchen area? Are they working in a bedroom? Are they working in a study? It's then about education, because you can't really go around to everybody's houses, especially in this climate, and start taking photos and things like that. So it's about the training. So for my clients, for example, I have a set of videos that they receive that their staff watch. And it's all about just not being silly at home, you know, making sure you're sitting on the correct kind of chair, making sure that if you do need to get something down from a shelf, that you don't stand on a cushion, that you're still using, you know, appropriate chairs or chairs that don't have legs on. So it's actually very similar to what you would be doing in the office place anyway. So most of that's going to be based around the training that that person receives.
Fabulous. No, that's great. And somebody has helpfully popped into the group as well, somewhere that you can go online to do this, and we'll be collating all of the notes and the things that you have to share, Matthew, so that's brilliant. The only other question that came up from somebody that probably does need to be delved into, but I don't know if you want to comment,
Sure.
is just, it's probably too far into the future to think about really, but when we are allowed to go back, do you foresee anybody being able to basically say they're too nervous to go back, even if you're putting everything into place? And do you think that will have any legal standing? Is probably the best way to ask that question.
It could. And the only reason it could is because of the Mental Health Act. So there is a legal responsibility for employers to ensure that the mental health of their employees is sound whilst they're working for them. So this is quite important for anyone furloughed right now. There is a legal responsibility to ensure that the impact of furlough is not affecting their mental health. And you use a similar process for someone who says, I'm too concerned to come in on the bus, or I'm too concerned to get into work. It is a conduct issue because ultimately this person is refusing to do what you have asked, but the reason they're refusing is because of a psychological issue. It's because of fear of contracting an illness. So although there is support you can offer people in that scenario, eventually you do have to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to discipline this person because of that conduct, or if you're going to let it slip. If you let it slip, and that's fine, it's your companies, you can do what you want, bear in mind you're going to have to allow the same thing for other employees as well. And some people will just jump on the bandwagon of, oh, well, I'm scared of coming in, because they know you'll have to keep them at home. So it's better to explore why they're scared, put reasonable things in place to stop that. And then if they still refuse at that point, then yeah, you'd have to look at how you want to address that conduct. So it is an individual answer, to be fair.
Sorry, clearly I'm not supposed to be unmuted. I think it's fair to say that that will be a while before we're dealing with that. I have so many sort of claps and cheers in the chat, Matthew, so thank you so much.
I'm really happy. I am on LinkedIn, so if anybody wants to follow me, you can ask me a question directly. Most of my questions and queries come through my LinkedIn message box. I also do a host of series and videos most days in regards to Corona. I've stopped for the last couple of weeks because there's not really been anything to update. But this week and next week, there's going to be a mountain of it. So if for any reason you can't reach me through this, you can always send me a PM or a DM, whatever the kids call it, on LinkedIn.